Thank you, Peter and David, for this morning. A little bit overwhelming. I'm not an academic. Hey. Recently, I met a really good friend for a drink, and we got to talking about tattoos. And I sort of asked him, I said, if you had to have a tattoo, what would it be? And he said, I'd have "It's all about me" tattooed on my foot. And I really loved this honesty, and because I'm ever so slightly in awe of him, it made me feel liberated to make this talk about me. I started using a camera as a teenager, and I'd felt alienated as a teenager from a sort of incomprehensible world. And using a camera at that time was like one of those things I did at the time without really knowing why. I didn't sort of have the awareness. I wasn't sufficiently developed to know what I was doing, really. Until much later, it's just like one of those things that you get a realization about much later than the event itself. And what I realized was that the camera both protected me from the world and simultaneously enabled me to focus on it. And I don't know what part of me needed that protection, and during the talk I'm going to ask a lot of questions to which I haven't got answers. So what part of me was I trying to protect? It was not a specific love of the camera, but something about it made sense in a way that was beyond the piece of machinery. For the last 25 years, I've been exploring what for me have been the four elements of being a human. And very roughly and very simply, they were and are the mind, body, heart, and soul. Originally, when I was thinking about this quartet, it was mind, body, heart, and spirit. And I just started to get a bit tired of this word spirit. Oh, he's really spiritual. You know, she's really spiritual. And there was just something about it that I got on my nerves, really. And I could never find a sort of suitable definition of this word spirit until actually about a year ago when I opened a book and it said, the spirituality means to be awake. And that sort of was the first time when this whole spiritual spirit world made sense. This quartet of work began with a project called Allowed to Speak. I met with severely schizophrenic people living in Tower Hamlets in the early 90s. And it was just when the National Health Service and Community Care Act had come into being. A lot of people think that this is policy attributed to Thatcher's government, but it had been around since the 50s. So for once, you know, she wasn't at fault here. I shot the photographs in black and white, and I spoke to people and wrote down their stories. I didn't have an agenda at all, so I was not working as a journalist. I wasn't trying to point people in any direction. I was just enabling them to tell a story and have their photograph taken. And what I discovered, working in this way for the first time, that I don't know, maybe I'm slightly suspicious of a camera, but what I found was that combining images and words that people spoke, something became whole. So the images and the words worked together to make something greater than the parts. And I really, really liked this way of working. And again, apologies to the camera, but it just, for me, it felt more wholesome. It felt more whole. And at the same time, I became particularly interested in the nature and meaning of suffering. And again, Bjorn was mentioned this morning, but I was interested in his ideas around the difference between an experience of suffering and the knowledge of it. And if I've got this right, I understood beyond meant that it's only an experience of suffering that's transformative. And this seemed to become more and more make sense in my life and in the world, and generally in the way I was working with people that were severely ill. They had an experience of suffering, and to me, they seemed transformed. They seemed to be somewhere else, somewhere almost envious. Between this and the next part of the quartet, which is a project called We're All the Same, which is a project about people with cancer, I went through the Ignatian spiritual exercises and had a long period of Freudian analysis. I hope it's okay to say that in daylight. And it was a brilliant time, and I had a very strict and brilliant spiritual director, and our contract was that I would devote an hour a day to prayer. And he just wasn't going to be interested in me unless I made that commitment. And I was happy with it. I was very obedient. And again, I looked at obedience up to then as being something a bit dodgy. And then I came across Gustav Metz, who said that obedience is about being true to the gift of humanity we have been given. And this struck a chord. And again, I think this asks another question of, is there something about the soul going on here with that? Being true to the gift of humanity we've been given. And I love this idea, it was refreshing. I'm digressing, but during one of these hours of prayer, during the Ignatian exercises, in fact, what was revealed to me was that colour was the space between black and white. And this was huge. This was a huge discovery. And up until then, I'd seen things in a very black and white way, and I'd been totally struck and in awe of the black and white image. And so to start thinking with a colour head-on was new. And I've never been able to take black and white pictures since, really, because what I realised is that black and white exists in colour. Colour does not exist in black and white. And so I was interested in that space between two extremes, and grey didn't do it for me. The cancer project was a real challenge, and it was the first time that I consciously encountered and thought about voyeurism and witness in my work. What was I actually doing with a camera? I was going into people's rooms. They were seriously ill. A lot of them were dying. A lot of them died before the project was over. And I was going in there with a camera and asking them if I could take their picture and talk to them. And I just froze, really, for a few months, and just kept making excuses as to why I couldn't meet so-and-so today. I couldn't make it to the hospital. I just kept making excuses, and I couldn't face this problem. And then eventually it dawned on me that, and I remember my training as a spiritual director, and I remembered my analytic experience, and I thought, well, all I have to do is be there. It sounds really easy, doesn't it? It's I don't know if it is. And again, this came up this morning. A lot of things in my film and in my talk have come up this morning, which is really comforting. And a lot of being present seemed to be about respecting silence. Don't mess with it, and don't fill it with my own projections and insecurities. Just let the silence happen. And with that new approach, the project started to work. It came together. And just by basically sitting with people and letting things happen. That was a wonderful breakthrough. And when I came to show the work, it was reviewed by Charles Darwin at The Independent. And I was going to try and mess around with this talk to make it not seem so egomaniacal, but he writes about it so well that I'm going to do it. And one of the paradoxes of the camera is that it is both a subjective instrument and an entirely impersonal one. Wainwright explores this paradox to look without being seen. His reticent photographs tell us little about the man who made them. Far from being made into mirrors for his own fears, his subjects are allowed to speak for themselves. his interest isn't showing the differences in their self-image, but simply in observing that each of them has a self-image. And we've all got a self-image. And in the film you're about to see, what's very clear is, well, we all know everybody's got a self-image, everybody's got a self. After this, I moved on to the heart, the third part of the quartet, and looked at people having heart transplants with the sound artist John Wynne, who recorded their voices. This was the first time I'd worked with voice in such an intensity, really. And again, like words and images made something whole, the voice took that even further, because what is the voice? The voice is the Word made flesh. The voice is an externalization of an inner world. A photograph is an external image. So I love this idea of the voice, the internalization and the external image coming together to make something whole, to make something more. I use still images and sound. The sound recorders were time-based, and this represented the limbo of people waiting for a heart transplant, because what they're ultimately waiting for is someone to die so that they can live. And the juxtaposition of the still image and the moving word files and stories, it just worked with this idea of people waiting. And this privacy is made public with the spoken word. And storytelling, I love storytelling, and for me today really is all about storytelling. I think David has told his story, I think Peter has told his story, I think Andrew will probably tell his story later. We're telling our stories. And now comes to soul. And as Peter said earlier, there was a certain synchronicity around all this. I contacted him, not made contact him for a while, and mentioned this project. And he mentioned that his book was in motion. And I don't know, I've realised recently that nothing is strange. It's a redundant idea for me. It's a sort of lazy word. What can be strange? And he talked about Wittgenstein. And I thought, oh, I've heard of this guy, and I don't know much about him. And I was going to say I didn't see anything Wittgensteinian about him in my work, but he said Wittgensteinian, which I don't know which is right. And
I say that better.
Do you? And I've been longing to say this in public since I met him, and I talked to the same Charles art critic that I mentioned earlier about this, and I said, can I say Wittgensteinian in public? And he said to me, look, only if you want to sound like a pretentious plonker. And I thought I really do, actually. I thought that's a good way to sound. But anyway, Wittgenstein said, the face is the soul of the body. And I don't know. Again, I'm really not sure about this. That's up to other people to tell me what they think. The thing is, with the Soul Project, my process had begun, and I'd meet with people. There's people here that have given me the privilege of sitting with them and recording and filming them. And so literally the process was I'd meet with somebody, I'd ask them to look into a camera for 3 minutes, and then separately record their voice telling me about their relationship with London and what soul meant to them in their life. And so far I visited about 60 people. Because of the time problem with this, I could only include 21 in this film. It's about 40 minutes long. I've had to exclude 35 people. But their presence is all the more vital in a way because of that. And what's important about this film for me is that it's not really a question about what you look at and listen to. It's about what you see and hear. And this is, I think, so true of many things, art in particular. Another thing occurred to me in the last few weeks about objectivity. And like the word strange, I don't really have time for. I can't find a place for objectivity. Is that really a thing? Does that exist? Can there be such a thing as objectivity? beyond the things we know as objects. I don't know. With this work, it's not for me to say what soul is or isn't. I'm not interested in that. It's not my intention with this work. In his book, Peter says, "My aim is to create a space where new pictures of self may emerge for you, the reader." And this is what I've tried to do with this soul work, but just, for reader, put in viewer and listener. And before I show the film, there's just one final quote from Baudrillard. And it just blows my mind, this quote, really. Ever since I first saw it, and again, I've longed to say it in public. And he said, "A photograph is simply the trace left behind by the disappearance of everything else." A photograph is simply the trace left behind by the disappearance of everything else. And for me, that resonates with soul somehow, but maybe someone can tell me later. So, what you're about to see is really an experiment. It's how the first time showing the work. It's the first time I've seen it not on a computer screen or on a telephone. And here it is.